Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 299 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Today, we're in for a special treat. Holly White, who normally works behind the microphone at Ben Franklin's World, has decided to step in front of the microphone and host an episode for us. Now, if you haven't met Holly, Holly White is the assistant editor of digital projects and OI publications at the Omohundro Institute. She's also an associate producer of Ben Franklin's World. Now, as a historian of the early American Republic, Holly specializes in the history of gender, family, and childhood and youth. When not working on various OI publications, Holly is working on her own publication, a book which she'll publish with the University of Virginia Press, and which is titled Protecting the Innocents: Legal and Cultural Debates About Age and Ability in the Early United States. But before we speak with Holly, just a reminder that Ben Franklin's World has an email newsletter. This newsletter will help you keep up to date with Ben Franklin's World, as it only sends when we have a new episode or when the Omohundro Institute and I have something exciting to share with you. Signing up for the Ben Franklin's World email newsletter is free and easy. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and that you'll join me in a warm welcome for today's guest host, Holly White.
What can a portrait reveal about the history of colonial British America? Portraits were both deeply personal and yet collaborative artifacts left behind by people of the past. A portrait of a man depicted with medals might tell us something about his military success. The presence of a book might indicate the interest in learning. When historians look at multiple portraits created around the same time and place, their similarities can reveal important social connections, trade relationships, or cultural beliefs about race and gender in early America. In this episode, Janine Yorimoto Boldt, Associate Curator of American Art at the Chazen Museum of Art and the researcher behind the digital project Colonial Virginia Portraits, leads us on an exploration of portraiture and what it can reveal about the early American past. During our discussion of Colonial Virginia Portraits, Janine reveals how historians use portraits as historical sources, why early Americans commissioned portraits, who commissioned portraits, and what portraits can tell us about early American history. Our guest is an associate curator of American art at the Chazen Museum of Art in Madison, Wisconsin. She is a researcher behind ColonialVirginiaPortraits.com, a digital project produced by the Omohundro Institute, and her current book project, The Politics of Portraiture in Colonial Virginia, examines how colonists used portraits to construct social relationships. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Janine Yorimoto Boldt.
Thanks so much for having me.
Janine, you partnered with the Omohundro Institute to launch the digital project ColonialVirginiaPortraits.com. Would you start us off by telling us about the Colonial Virginia Portraits website?
Colonial Virginia Portraits is essentially a database that includes all of the portraits and references to portraits that I found during my dissertation research into colonial Virginia portraiture. It includes portraits of Virginians or portraits that were recorded as hanging in Virginia. So sometimes there's English men and English women whose portraits hung in Virginia but weren't necessarily ever a visitor there or ever lived there. Most of the portraits were painted in Virginia, but many of them were painted elsewhere, including Philadelphia, England, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Over 350 images are included in the database. They were generously provided by various institutions who owned the portraits. And this allows people to see all these portraits in one place and make visual connections between portraits. And I've organized it so that visitors to the site can browse the database by artist, by family name, the rough decade of the portrait's creation, the historic locations that were associated with the portrait, so where it was painted and or where it hung, as well as browse by attribute. I tagged each painting with attributes, including if they're holding a prop, that prop is tagged, flower, book, paper. If they're wearing a certain color, that color is tagged. So you can search by, say, blue dresses. You can also search by size of portrait. So this allows visitors and myself to find visual trends in portraiture, as well as to see where portraits were located, see who was painted, and to see all of that in one place so that we can start making arguments about how we can study colonial society through portraiture and how colonial Virginians wanted to represent themselves.
Would you share with us how you use portraits as a historical source?
So I use portraits to think about how individual subjects, as well as communities of subjects, wanted to present themselves to the world. Portraits are basically idealized visions of the subject, sort of a visual biography that you can read through portraits through very careful looking. And usually people were only painted once in their lifetime, so they thought very carefully about how to be presented in their portrait. I use portraits alongside archival records and biographical information to understand what was happening when a subject was painted, why they might have been painted in a certain way at a certain time, and what messages that they wanted to convey through the portrait. Because portraits can tell us a lot about how subjects performed, gender, race, and status, and what kind of values they had. And communities of people developed preferences and practices for portraiture that, when viewed together, help shed light on community values and practices and tell us about society at large. Some portraits can even tell us about subjects' political ideology. And I also think very carefully about audience, who the portrait was intended to be seen by, and how might the audience have shaped the image. So that's why I created and used the database, Colonial Virginia Portraits, because I can learn a lot by studying large number of portraits at the same time that I do intensive research on individual subjects, right? And I can understand how that individual subject fits within a much larger context by looking at what their contemporaries are doing.
When you study a portrait as a source, what types of visual information are you looking for?
First, a look at the overall style, which helps you date a portrait and can say a lot about how a person wanted to be perceived. So by style, I can mean, you could have a very Baroque style, which very over the top, lots of stuff going on. Or you can have a more sort of neat and plain style, which a lot of Virginians preferred by the late 18th century, which sort of emphasizes a more modest value and frugality. Also look at iconography, so what signs or symbols are in the portrait. Things like flowers are symbols of fertility. Books can signify education or a profession, and then think about what those different signs and symbols mean. And also think about what the subjects might be wearing and why they might be wearing a certain outfit.
Now that we have an understanding of why portraits can make such great source material, let's get into the history of colonial British American portraiture. Who commissioned portraits in colonial British America, and why did they commission them?
So for the most part, portraits were commissioned by wealthy individuals. Most portraits in the colonies were commissioned by colonists for their own homes and to be family records, and were intended to be passed down through their descendants. Their portraits were hung in the most public areas of the subject's house, perhaps their parlor, hall, or dining room. And occasionally the portraits were given to family or friends as gifts, and some were even sent abroad. Sometimes portraits were commissioned to mark a special occasion, such as a marriage, or for men if they had a new political appointment. Colonists could also commission portraits because they wanted to participate in a very British tradition that had formerly been limited to aristocrats in England. By the 17th century, portraits were becoming more accessible to English men and English women beyond the aristocracy. And by commissioning a portrait, colonists were proclaiming their status and their civility and their ability and desire to participate in sort of British modes of culture. Someone would commission a portrait by visiting an artist at his studio space. So usually artists would have a studio in their own home or in their shop. And so a colonist could go visit an artist working in a colonial city and commission a portrait directly there. The artist John Smybert, for example, owned a shop, and his studio was held above his shop. Some artists would advertise their services in newspapers, and these ads would also include how patrons could get in touch with the artist. In more rural communities, like in Virginia or parts of New York, it was more common for artists to travel and visit patrons in their homes rather than set up an urban studio. So in Virginia, it seems that most artists traveled from plantation home to plantation home painting their subjects, and that some artists at least carried letters of introduction and found new customers through word of mouth and personal family networks. If you were visiting England to get your portrait painted, you would visit a studio. And then the sizes of these canvases often determined the cost of the portrait, partly because, of course, it took more time and labor to paint a larger portrait. The size of the portrait also determined how much of the sitter would be painted and how many props or how much background might be included in the portrait. And then the cost would depend also on the artist. In 1752, John Wollaston charged the governor, James Hamilton, in Philadelphia. He charged him £36 for 2 half-length portraits. So these are really expensive objects. Some working class laborers were paying only £10 a month for annual rent in a place like Philadelphia. So that's a starting price for an oil portrait for a lot of these subjects. So it sort of limits who can afford them.
What was the process of sitting for a portrait like? And how much say did a person have about how they would be depicted?
So unlike other types of painting, portraits had to make the patron happy. So if they didn't like the resulting image, it's really hard for the artist to find someone else to purchase or display the portrait. So some artists found this really annoying, but other artists just considered it part of the job. And we know from a few letters and diaries that artists sometimes had to alter a composition because the subject was unhappy with it. For example, there's a great letter written by George Carlyle of Alexandria, Virginia, who records that he thought that the initial portrait that the artist John Hesselius painted for him had flattered him too much and he looked much too young. And so he wrote that he made the artist fix the painting so that he would look older and truer to his appearance. But of course, we should also understand that artists had a say in the portrait too. Portraits really should be seen as negotiation between a sitter and the artist. And the sitter, had to trust an artist to a certain extent to know and apply the latest fashions and what would look best. Portraits typically required 2 to 3 sittings with the subject, and the artist would have the subject sit for up to 4 to 5 hours. From artist manuals and anecdotes from the periods, it seems that at the first sitting, the artist would do a sort of a general sketch of the subject and apply sort of a base color for the face. And the second sitting would last longer, and the painter would add greater detail. If there was a third sitting, the artist would sort of add all the finishing touches. And the backgrounds and many details of clothing could be finished without the subject present. So it's long periods of sitting. And there's some evidence that suggests it could be a social event. So maybe the subject would have a friend or friends or family there with them to keep them entertained.
In the 17th and early 18th centuries, was there much difference between the portraits that were painted in England versus painted in the colonies?
Artists working in the colonies followed English fashions and styles very carefully and often copied or were inspired by English portrait prints. And colonists wanted to look British and wanted to follow the latest British trends. However, the talents of the artists working in the colonies, especially in the early colonial period, varied and were often sort of lacking in comparison to artists working in England. The really successful English portrait painters never traveled to the colonies in this early period. So there was no one to formally train colonial-born artists. So artists, therefore, in the colonies were largely self-trained or were sort of lesser talented Englishmen who would come to the colonies to seek customers where there were less competition. Sometimes when we look at portraits painted in the colonies, especially in the 17th and early 18th centuries, they sort of look like they're in a very different style, but I'd argue it's more about the painter's technique that makes them look different. There were regional preferences and interpretations of style, but generally the colonial style follows the British style pretty closely. In the late 18th century, perhaps, artists like John Singleton Copley were trying to develop sort of their own style. But really, colonists largely continued to follow British styles throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th century. Even into the early Republic, they were following the neoclassical trends and the romantic trends that were coming out of England well into the 19th century.
The level of detail in many of these portraits is impressive and quite beautiful. How did one become a portrait painter? And who were some of the most sought-after portraiture artists in the 17th and 18th centuries?
So American-born artists either taught themselves, or they studied with another working artist who was in the area, or they might have traveled to England to study painting and then come back, which is the case with artists like Charles Willson Peale. There were more formal artist networks and studios in London where artists could train. So in London, many artists would begin studying with a successful painter who ran a studio, and many started as studio assistants or drapery painters, painting clothing and background elements in portrait for really successful portrait artists who would only focus on the face, and then their workshop assistants would finish the portraits for them. And then the really talented artists could then eventually set up their own studios. There's also some smaller schools and eventually the Royal Academy of Art where painters could study in London. So many portrait painters working in colonial America are still unknown and undocumented, but some of the most prolific portrait artists in colonial America were Robert Feake, John Wollaston, John Singleton Copley, and Charles Willson Peale. And all of these artists also did some traveling through the colonies and painted a lot of portraits, which suggests that they were quite popular.
One portrait that caught my eye on colonialvirginiaportraits.com was that of Daniel Park II, painted by John Klostermann around 1705. Who was Daniel Park II, and why did he commission this portrait of himself?
Park was born in Virginia, and then actually at a very young age, he went with his mother, Rebecca Evelyn, to live in England with his Evelyn relatives, and he was actually educated in England. But as a teenager, after his mother died, he was sent back to Virginia to sort of inherit the plantation. And while there, he ended up marrying a woman named Jane Ludwell, who was the daughter of one of the most influential and powerful men in Virginia at the time. And he had 2 daughters. He was not well liked in Virginia. It seemed he was always picking fights and got into public disagreements with the royal governor, with Reverend James Blair, who was one of the most important people in the colony. And so it seems that one of the reasons he left Virginia was because he sort of had no friends there. So he was seeking new political office, new appointments, and sort of a new network in England. And so he actually abandoned his wife and his 2 daughters, as well as an illegitimate son, and he left Virginia in 1697. He ends up joining the army and served as the aide-de-camp to the Duke of Marlborough during the War of Spanish Succession. And during the war, he was present at the really important Battle of Blenheim in 1704, which resulted in an English victory over the French and their allies. And it was a major turning point in the war in this major imperial conflict. So Marlborough chooses Park to hand deliver news of the English army's victory to Queen Anne. And Marlborough arguably became the most important man in British politics because of his military success and personal friendship with Queen Anne. And his wife, Zara, the Duchess of Marlborough, was Queen Anne's closest friend for a long time. So as a reward for Park's loyalty and military service, Marlborough helped to get Park appointed the royal governor of the Leeward Islands. And Park, therefore, became one of the very few American-born royal governors. So he rose to fame pretty quickly. Park commissioned John Klostermann to paint his portrait to memorialize or commemorate his military and diplomatic service and sort of celebrate his new appointments. Klostermann was actually one of the most popular artists working in England at the time, and he sent the portrait back to his family in Virginia. And now, in part, this was to ensure that his portrait lived on in his family collection and that his descendants would remember him. But I think he also really wanted to show off his massive success to other Virginians in the colony who would see it.
Is this the only portrait that was painted of Daniel Park?
There are actually several documented portraits of Park, which is pretty unusual for a colonial Virginian. Klostermann actually painted 2 identical copies of this portrait of Daniel Park, which we were talking about, one for each of Park's 2 daughters. He sent the 2 portraits back to Virginia, where they descended in the family collections of his daughters, Lucy Park Byrd and Frances Park Custis. But around the same time, he was also painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller and Michael Dahl, who were 2 other prominent artists working in London at the time. Kneller was actually the Queen's official painter. Those portraits also still exist today, and they descended in English or European collections. But unfortunately, I've not been able to figure out who the original owners were. Perhaps they were gifts to important military or political officials or contacts in England. But we also know that Park was painted in the 1690s as a young man by an unknown artist. Unfortunately, that portrait doesn't seem to exist anymore, but he wrote in a letter that he was sending a portrait of himself from Virginia to his Evelyn relatives back in England so that they would remember him. And then Park's portraits, all of them are recorded on the Colonial Virginia Portraits database because he was a Virginian. He was Virginian born and he had Virginian descendants and Virginia property. And at least 3 of the portraits had a history in Virginia.
Janine, would you describe the Klostermann portrait of Daniel Park II for us?
So when you look at the portrait, you see a man wearing a long curly wig. He was wearing a really richly patterned outfit. He's got sort of a burnt orange colored velvet jacket with gold embroidery over a blue and gold embroidered waistcoat. It's really lavish fabric. He's got a gold lace or brocade scarf wrapped around his waist. He's got a lacy cravat tied around his neck, and peeking out under it on a bright red ribbon is a miniature portrait of Queen Anne surrounded in diamonds. He's got one hand on his hip and the other hand resting on a stone pediment just above his dress sword, which hangs on his hip. Just behind him, he's got his military helmet and his breastplate, so his armor is just behind him. You also see a pile of gold medal and gold chains, which were medals commemorating, again, the victory at Blenheim. And those are tied together with a bright red ribbon. And then he's standing in front of this rocky cliff or outcropping. And then in the distance, you get a glimpse of a battlefield and you see men firing cannon in the distance. So it's a really sort of lavish, fashionable, expensive portrait of an English gentleman and official.
Would you tell us more about the miniature of Queen Anne? Was it common to include a miniature of the current monarch in one's portrait?
Yes. So the miniature of Queen Anne that appears in the portrait was apparently given to Park as a special reward for delivering news of the victory at Blenheim. So Park later recorded, and I quote, "Her Majesty gave me her picture and £1,000 and told me she would take care of me," which is just a great statement because it shows that she apparently gave him her portrait as a symbol that she would look out for him and basically grant him special favors. And we know she eventually did because he was named governor of the Leeward Islands. Portraits of monarchs, both miniature and oil portrait, were part of an established tradition of European diplomacy. So the monarch's image was a special gift that kind of showed particular favor, usually to diplomats or favorite courtiers. So it's actually pretty unusual for someone of Park's rank and status to receive such a gift directly from the queen. So it does indicate that he was sort of specially favored at court. And it was not common to include a miniature of a current monarch in one's portrait unless you were royalty yourself. So I don't personally know of any other British portrait from this period that includes the monarch's image. So it's actually a pretty bold move by Park to wear the queen's portrait so prominently around his neck. And I believe Park included it in his portraits. And it appears in all of his surviving portraits, by the way, because he wanted to show off his connection to the queen and shape his reputation and legacy as a successful American-born British diplomat and military official. So it shows that he had risen from a planter to a royal governor, and he was actually known to wear the miniature around his neck daily.
I don't know about you, but I really wonder if the miniature of Queen Anne still exists today, which is why we're going to pose this question to Janine right after Liz tells us about our episode sponsor.
Conducting historical research is a painstaking process. Even if you're a historian like Janine, who spends a lot of time examining historic portraits and artwork. Crafting books, articles, and digital projects is a multi-year process that includes searching out historical sources, interpreting those sources, and then taking all the information that you found to make a case for why we should view the past a certain way. Likewise, each episode of Ben Franklin's World is a result of a painstaking process. Each minute you hear on this podcast is a result of 1 hour of the digital audio team's labor. Now, the Omohundro Institute and I are committed to creating high-quality new episodes because we want you to have easy access to well-researched history and information about the early American past. but it does take a lot of work and resources to sustain this podcast. And the Omohundro Institute and I could really use your help to keep it going. This is why I'm asking you to join the Ben Franklin's World subscription program by becoming a subscriber. Your subscription of $5.99 per month or $60 per year will help us continue to produce the high-quality episodes that you've come to love. Episodes that skip hyperbole and provide solid historical research on complex issues. Plus, your subscription also helps to ensure that this podcast continues to find its way into classrooms and study guides, lunchtime learning sessions, and extended dinnertime conversations. As a thank you for your support, you'll receive a monthly bonus episode on the last Friday of each month, and you'll never have your episodes interrupted again with ads like this one. Please become a subscriber. Join the Ben Franklin's World subscription program at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe and help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. Join us at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe.
Janine, does the miniature of Queen Anne still exist today?
It's kind of unclear. Mount Vernon has in its collection a miniature portrait of Queen Anne that clearly descended through the Custis family. However, if you look really closely at the portraits of Park, the miniatures in all the surviving portraits of Park do not match. They're all slightly different, which is really strange. So the miniature owned by Mount Vernon does closely match the miniature that Park wears in a portrait by Michael Dahl. And you can see all of these portraits on the website. But it doesn't exactly match the miniature in the Kneller or Klostermann portraits. If you were able to zoom in super closely on the Klostermann portrait, you'd see behind Queen Anne, there's a crown. And the miniature that exists and has a family history as being the miniature that's now in the Mount Vernon collection does not have this crown. So it's unclear why there are multiple miniatures of Queen Anne in this portrait, what happened to the miniature Park was given. And Park also died in Antigua in 1711. And it's unclear how the miniature would have gotten from Antigua back to Virginia and his daughter's family. So it's a good mystery. I don't know if we'll solve it, but if it does still exist, it may very well be the one in the Mount Vernon collection.
Is there anything else Park included in his portrait that might surprise us? And how much say did Park have in his own depiction?
The medals in the portrait that he includes are exact copies of medals that were gifted to him by the Dutch in reward for his military service after the Battle of Blenheim. And the Dutch were British allies during the War of Spanish Succession. It's not necessarily surprising, but it's pretty cool since they're another record of his rewards. But it also highlights the very international nature of Park's career and that he wanted to commemorate this career in these portraits that he sent back to Virginia. Since the miniature and the medals are pretty much exact replicas or believed to be exact replicas of real objects Park had, he would have brought them to Klostermann's studio for them to be painted, which suggests that Park definitely helped direct his image, especially since we know that the medals also appear in his portrait by Kneller, and the miniature appears in all of his known portraits. He clearly is demanding that some of this stuff gets repeated and gets included in all of his images. The Klostermann portraits were also ones that he definitely gave to his daughters. So he was personally invested in this composition and would have paid for it and approved it before finalizing his agreement with Klostermann. But Klostermann probably did have a lot of artistic freedom as well. Klostermann had a really good reputation. He was a well-established artist. He was known for painting these sort of really rich fabrics that Daniel Park wears in his portrait. Park probably picked Klostermann for a reason, and he probably picked Klostermann knowing the type of work Klostermann could do. And so he probably trusted the artist to make a lot of the decisions about the portrait.
Before we wrap things up, would you tell us what became of Daniel Park? Where did Daniel's story end? And what does his life reveal to us about the colonial British Atlantic world?
As I sort of mentioned before, Daniel Park was not a very nice person. And so he was also not a popular governor. In 1707, he eventually moved to Antigua reluctantly. He did not want to move to the West Indies. He eventually moves to Antigua to take up residence as governor of the Leeward Islands. The local planters hated him. He tried to rule the island like a military commander, which makes sense I guess, given his background. But he was very, very unpopular. And his personal behavior only added to this bad reputation. It's believed he had affairs with married women. He mistreated women. He was sort of co-opting enslaved labor from local planters and angering a lot of people. So the locals actually tried to get him recalled as governor, and he had to defend himself to the queen, and he refused to give up his post. And then he actually survived one assassination attempt before being brutally murdered during a revolt in 1711. And some of the accounts of his murder that came out in trials and histories of the event are really graphic. And in accounts of the uprising and murder, it's worth mentioning that the miniature of Queen Anne is specifically mentioned as being ripped from his neck and taken away from him as a symbol of his downfall. So I think Park's story is just a reminder of all the connections between the mainland colonies, the West Indies, and how dynamic and mobile these colonists could be, and how colonists in this period thought of themselves very much as British subjects. I mean, it's great because Park's life involved multiple trips across the Atlantic. He served in the English army, on the continent, in an imperial conflict, and then he was murdered in service to the Queen, showing how limited, actually, the empire's power could be in the colonial period. He was the Queen's representative, and yet he was killed in a revolt. And in order to keep the peace on the island, his murderers were actually pardoned, and they got away with it. The portraits of Park help also reveal these things, but also show how important images could be in this period in shaping public reputations. It's also a reminder of how cosmopolitan these early colonists really were, right? That such an expensive and fashionable London portrait was hanging in these Virginia plantation homes, which we don't think of necessarily as cosmopolitan spaces.
The story behind Daniel Park II's portrait is a fascinating one. But the Klostermann portrait is just one of hundreds of portraits we can find on colonialvirginiaportraits.com. From a historian's perspective, would you share with us your favorite portrait to use as a historical source and why you find it so compelling?
My favorite portrait, probably ever, is actually one of Daniel Park's daughter, Lucy Park Byrd. Again, you can find this one on the website. So Lucy Park Byrd was painted in 1716. She was also painted on a trip to London because she went to London with her husband on a business trip. It's just such a compelling portrait because she is painted so assertively and in command of her own body. And she's pointing somewhere in the distance. And she's got an enslaved attendant behind her wearing livery. She's got a basket that appears to have been made by Southeastern indigenous peoples in the corner. And there's sort of white linen coming out of it. Her husband was involved in the Southeastern Indian trade. Of course, she's a wife of a planter, so they own slaves. There's enslaved people working in their house. The audience for this portrait would have been her family, local Virginians, but also all of the enslaved people that the family owned, and the local indigenous traders who were coming in and out of their Westover plantation house. So it's a really fabulous portrait to think through issues of trade, of slavery, of race, of indigenous relations, and how gender and sexuality is portrayed in this image. Most images of women are fairly passive. They're often sitting or at an angle, and she's so assertive. And so you can think about what does that mean for her performance of gender in this period.
Janine, in what ways do you think portraiture adds to our knowledge about early America? What can we understand about early America that only a portrait might yield to us when we consider it as a historical source?
Daniel Park and Lucy Park Byrd are both great examples of how portraiture was used to imagine and record colonists' place within the British Empire. Right? These are records of how these people saw themselves within this empire as well as their local community. And they also reveal how colonists wanted to be remembered. And because portraits were negotiated between artist and subject, we can think about how colonists actively were engaging with the construction of British American identities, gender, race, status, as they decided how they would be portrayed in their portraits. And we should also remember that because portraits were intended to record a subject for posterity, we today are actually still one of the intended audiences for the portraits. They were intended for people, however long they survived, to be seeing these records of their lives. And so I think that opens up a whole other level of understanding and connection to early America through these works of art. And in some cases, as in Lucy Park Byrd, her portrait is one of the few sources we have about Lucy that isn't told only from her husband's perspective. In Lucy's case, we can also see the portrait as a record of herself. And as artworks, there's aesthetic value and interest in them that is different from written records. Art is fun to think about with history because you have to think not only about what you see, but how you see it and how all these stylistic and aesthetic choices affect the image's message or how the viewer takes in an image. For example, the lines of a painting can lead your eye to a specific spot on the canvas and affect what you're seeing first. So careful artists will lead your eye to the most important elements of a painting. So you have to think not just about the subject, but the artist, the viewer, the space where it hung, and sort of what the person wants you to know about them from this image they left behind.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what would have happened if everyone in early America had had the opportunity to have a portrait commissioned of themselves? How might our understanding or perception of early America be different today?
This is a great question because if only it were so. I think surviving portraits give us a very whitewashed and sort of rosy view of the 18th century, right? Pretty dresses and jewelry and fabrics and lots of flowers and landscapes. But in reality, right, the majority of people never sat for their portrait. So if we had portraits representing people from all races and classes, we'd have a much different view, I think, of the 18th century. I think we'd have a much greater appreciation for how diverse early American society was. There'd be a lot more laborers, and there'd be a lot more Black and Indigenous subjects that we would have images of. So we'd have a much better understanding of how most people dressed and saw themselves and interacted, as well as how enslaved people wanted to be pictured. And we just don't have that kind of image today. So I think our understanding or our perception of early America would be changed drastically if we had images of all these different types of people.
Before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you are researching and writing about now?
Sure. So I am working on turning my research on how colonial Virginians use portraits to shape social relationships and participate in empire building. And I'm turning that into a book manuscript, as well as an article about the erasure of slavery and enslaved people from portraiture. And at the Chazen Museum of Art, I'm also researching the historic American art collection and thinking about how it can be interpreted and reinstalled in the gallery.
Where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
So the best and easiest place is through colonialvirginiaportraits.org, where you can find a contact form at the bottom of each page, and you can contact me that way. Or you can find me on the Chazen Museum of Art staff page.
Janine Yorimoto Boldt, thank you for taking the time with us today and for taking us through the importance of American portraiture as a historical source.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
When looking at portraits from the colonial period, or any period really, Janine reminds us that we, modern-day viewers, are still an intended audience. We have to think about what those sitting for the portraits wanted us to know about them, and how they wanted to be remembered. In Daniel Park II's case, he wanted us to be aware of his military achievements and his proximity to Queen Anne. His daughter, Lucy Park Byrd, wanted us to know about her elite status, as well as the fact her family was involved in local indigenous trade. But as intriguing as colonial portraits can be, because they allow us to literally see people from the past, We have to remember that Lucy, Daniel, and anyone else fortunate enough to have had a portrait painted of themselves would have come from wealth. And the information their portraits communicate to us tells us only one side of the story of early America.
That was a very interesting conversation. Thank you, Holly. Now, if you'd like more information about Janine and her digital project, colonialvirginiaportraits.com, or any of the notes and links Holly and Janine talked about today, check out the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/299. Please help support our work to bring great historical scholarship right to your ears. Become a Ben Franklin's World subscriber at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. That's benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, Karen Wolf, and Peyton Young. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, we'll be back next week for a very special episode 300. I know, it's hard to believe, but we're already at episode 300. Okay, Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.